You have exactly 5 seconds to explain why you think you belong in this room, Richard Whitmore said, his voice carrying across the crystal-lit ballroom with the effortless confidence of a man who believed wealth made him untouchable. Conversations stopped one table at a time until nearly every guest inside the Grand Manhattan Heritage Gala turned to watch. Hundreds of business leaders, philanthropists, celebrities, and investors shifted their attention toward the elegant woman standing alone near the entrance, dressed in a simple black evening gown without flashy diamonds, without a famous entourage, and without any visible sign that she belonged among America's financial elite. Naomi Brooks met Richard's stare without raising her voice. At 43, she had spent 2 decades building one of the country's most respected investment firms, yet she had learned long ago that real power rarely announced itself. Tonight she had intentionally arrived alone. No assistants, no security detail, no luxury motorcade waiting outside. She wanted to experience the evening exactly as any unknown guest might. What she discovered within the first minute told her more than months of polished boardroom presentations ever could. Richard Whitmore smiled as though he had already won an argument nobody else had heard. His wife, Eleanor, exchanged an amused glance with their daughter Olivia, who quietly laughed behind a champagne flute before whispering something that made 2 nearby guests grin uncomfortably. Naomi noticed every expression but refused to match any of them. The ballroom glittered beneath towering chandeliers, every marble column wrapped in soft gold lighting, while a string quartet filled the air with elegant music that suddenly felt much colder. This annual gala had one purpose beyond charity. Before the night ended, one family would secure a historic $1 billion strategic partnership, a deal already described by financial reporters as the business announcement of the year. Nearly everyone inside believed the Whitmore family would walk onto the stage as the evening's biggest winners. Richard stepped closer, carefully looking Naomi up and down before speaking loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear. Events like this are invitation only. People shouldn't wander into places they weren't meant to enter. A few polite laughs drifted through the crowd. Others looked away, unwilling to become involved. Naomi calmly reached into her evening clutch as if preparing to present her invitation, but Richard dismissed the gesture with a casual wave of his hand before she could finish. Olivia leaned toward one of her friends and murmured, "Confidence doesn't buy class." More laughter followed, softer this time, yet sharp enough to change the atmosphere across the ballroom. Near the registration desk, a young event coordinator named Emily Carter looked up from her tablet after hearing the exchange. Something about Naomi seemed familiar. She couldn't place it, but the face, the posture, the quiet confidence tugged at a memory she couldn't ignore. Emily glanced down at the executive guest list on her screen, then back toward the woman standing alone beneath the ballroom lights. Before she could investigate further, Richard took another deliberate step forward. The room seemed to hold its breath. Naomi remained perfectly still, her expression composed, her eyes calm, as though she already understood something no one else in that ballroom had yet realized. And somewhere beyond the applause, beyond the music, beyond the polished smiles of America's wealthiest families, the future of $1 billion deal had already begun to change. Richard Whitmore folded his hands behind his back as though he were hosting the evening instead of simply attending it. His smile never disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer polite. It carried the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime believing appearances revealed everything worth knowing. Eleanor Whitmore gently adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist before looking directly at Naomi with a sympathetic expression that somehow felt even more dismissive than her husband's confidence. "These events can be confusing," she said softly. "There is another reception downstairs for community guests." Olivia let out a small laugh. "I think someone probably gave her the wrong invitation." Several people nearby smiled without saying a word. Others suddenly became fascinated by their wine glasses, unwilling to interrupt what they assumed was an uncomfortable misunderstanding. Naomi simply looked around the ballroom. The orchestra continued playing. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and elegant desserts. Giant screens displayed photographs celebrating innovation, leadership, and opportunity. Every slogan decorating the room promised inclusion, respect, and vision for the future. Yet standing beneath those words, Naomi could already see the difference between a mission statement and genuine character. One security supervisor noticed the growing crowd and quietly walked closer, stopping several feet away while waiting for instructions from the event organizers. He did not speak. He simply observed. Richard noticed the uniform and appeared satisfied that the situation would soon disappear without disrupting the evening's schedule. "You should save yourself the embarrassment," he said. "Nobody wants a scene at a charity gala." Naomi answered with the same calm expression she had worn since entering the room. "Neither do I." Her voice was steady enough that a few guests exchanged uncertain looks. There was no anger, no pleading, no attempt to prove herself. That unexpected composure unsettled people more than an argument would have. Olivia tilted her head. It is amazing how confident some people become after watching motivational videos. A few scattered chuckles echoed across nearby tables. Naomi did not acknowledge them. Instead, her attention drifted toward the enormous stage where technicians quietly tested the presentation screens for the evening's final announcement. Behind those curtains waited the ceremony everyone had traveled across the country to witness. Financial journalists had already prepared headlines. Investors had already discussed future expansion. Television crews were ready to capture the symbolic handshake expected before the night ended. Everything appeared perfectly arranged. Near the registration desk, Emily Carter continued studying the executive guest database. The image beside one profile refused to leave her thoughts. She enlarged the photograph on her tablet, then slowly looked back toward Naomi. The hairstyle was different. The evening gown was simpler than the corporate portraits she remembered seeing in magazines. But the eyes were unmistakable. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. She checked the profile again. Executive founder. Lifetime board authority. Full event access. She blinked twice, convinced she had made a mistake. Then she searched another internal list reserved for keynote participants. The same name appeared again. Naomi Brooks. Emily quietly whispered the name to herself, barely believing it. Across the ballroom, Richard continued speaking with absolute confidence, completely unaware that the certainty filling his voice rested on an assumption that was already beginning to unravel. Naomi remained exactly where she stood, patient and composed, while the invisible threads connecting everyone in that ballroom slowly tightened around a truth that only one person had recognized so far. Emily Carter stared at the glowing screen in her hands as the sounds of polite conversation and soft violin music faded into the background. She searched the executive database one more time, hoping she had overlooked a detail, but every result only confirmed what she feared. Naomi Brooks was not simply an invited guest. She held permanent executive credentials, unrestricted access to every private function, and final approval authority over the evening's headline investment announcement. Emily felt a chill run through her arms. She looked across the ballroom toward Naomi, who still stood alone with the same composed expression, while Richard Whitmore continued speaking as though the entire room naturally belonged to him. Emily quietly approached the event director, standing near the stage. "I think there is a serious mistake," she whispered. The director barely looked away from his clipboard. "Not now? We are minutes away from the announcement." Emily lowered her voice even further. "You need to verify Naomi Brooks." The director sighed, clearly irritated by the interruption, then accepted the tablet from her hands. His confident expression lasted only a few seconds before his eyebrows slowly tightened. He enlarged the profile photograph, glanced toward Naomi, then immediately checked a second confidential list reserved for keynote participants. The same name appeared again, highlighted with executive authorization. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated. The master schedule had just updated. At precisely 9:30 that evening, the final agreement would require one signature before becoming legally binding. Only one signature. Naomi Brooks. Meanwhile, none of that uncertainty had reached the Whitmore family. Richard accepted congratulations from several investors who assumed the partnership was already complete. Eleanor smiled graciously as photographers requested another family portrait beneath the Charity Foundation banner. Olivia casually scrolled through social media while laughing about the awkward interruption near the entrance. "People really need to know when they are out of place," she said with quiet satisfaction. A nearby businessman nodded politely. "Tonight belongs to your family." Richard smiled without hesitation. "It certainly looks that way." Naomi listened without reacting. Years earlier, she had discovered that arrogance often became loudest only moments before reality changed direction. She slowly removed her phone from her evening clutch and unlocked the screen with one effortless motion. There was no panic, no dramatic expression. She opened a secure messaging application used only by her executive leadership team. The message contained 3 simple words: "Activate Protocol Orion." Less than 5 seconds later, her phone vibrated once. Message received. Executive coordination initiated. Legal team notified. Board members assembling. Naomi locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her clutch as though nothing had happened. Across the country, conference rooms that had been empty moments before began filling with attorneys, financial officers, and senior executives responding to the highest-level internal notification. Documents were secured. Digital approvals were paused. Every transaction connected to the billion-dollar partnership entered immediate executive review. Back inside the ballroom, the orchestra reached the final notes of another elegant performance. Waiters refreshed crystal glasses while guests applauded politely, completely unaware that the future everyone expected had quietly shifted beneath their feet. Emily watched Naomi from across the room with growing disbelief. For the first time that evening, she realized the calm woman standing alone had never looked isolated. She had looked completely certain, and certainty like that rarely belonged to someone who was about to lose anything. Emily Carter could no longer convince herself that she was imagining things. She quietly stepped away from the registration desk and walked toward the backstage operations office where only senior event staff were permitted. Her pulse quickened with every step. Inside the room, production managers monitored lighting cues, camera angles, and the countdown leading to the evening's final presentation. Emily approached the executive producer and placed the tablet on the control desk. "Please look at this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The producer frowned at the interruption until he recognized the highlighted executive profile. His expression changed instantly. He enlarged the authorization page, then opened the confidential keynote schedule. Naomi Brooks appeared once again, listed as the final approving executive before the partnership announcement. The producer looked toward the ballroom through the glass partition, then back at Emily. "Does anyone else know?" Emily slowly shook her head. "Not yet." He immediately reached for his headset, but stopped before pressing the button. If this information spread without confirmation, the evening could descend into confusion. He decided to verify everything personally. Out in the ballroom, Richard Whitmore continued greeting investors with the relaxed confidence of someone already celebrating victory. Every conversation centered around expansion, market influence, and the billion-dollar partnership expected to reshape the industry. One investor raised his glass. "Congratulations in advance, Richard. Everyone knows tonight belongs to the Whitmore family." Richard smiled proudly. "Some opportunities are simply earned." Naomi stood only a short distance away, quietly observing the room as though she were studying people rather than attending a celebration. She noticed who laughed the loudest, who avoided eye contact, and who seemed uncomfortable but unwilling to interrupt the moment. Years of leading negotiations had taught her that character often revealed itself long before contracts were signed. Across the ballroom, Emily carefully approached an older guest wearing a foundation board pin. "Excuse me," she asked politely. "Have you ever met Naomi Brooks?" The gentleman looked toward Naomi for less than a second before answering. "Only twice. Once at an economic summit in Washington and once at a private leadership forum in Boston." "What?" Emily felt the last trace of doubt disappear. "Nothing," she replied softly. "I just wanted to make sure." The gentleman narrowed his eyes. "Is something wrong?" Before Emily could answer, the master of ceremonies announced that the evening's signature presentation would begin in less than 15 minutes. The room filled with polite applause. Technicians adjusted the massive display screens while photographers gathered near the stage. Richard straightened his jacket, convinced history was about to favor his family. Olivia quietly admired the stage lighting reflected in her champagne glass. Eleanor smiled toward television cameras already positioning themselves for the anticipated announcement. None of them noticed the executive producer walking quickly toward the backstage communications center with visible concern. At that exact moment, Naomi's phone vibrated once inside her evening clutch. She glanced down for only an instant. Protocol Orion Phase 2 complete. Executive board connected. Final authorization secured. She slipped the phone away without changing her expression. Emily watched that tiny movement from across the ballroom and suddenly understood something that everyone else had completely missed. Naomi had never been waiting for acceptance from anyone in that room. She had been patiently waiting for the truth to arrive on its own, and with every passing minute, the invisible distance between confidence and consequence was becoming impossibly small. The applause faded as guests settled into their seats, but the tension surrounding Naomi refused to disappear. Richard Whitmore looked toward her one more time, clearly irritated that she had not quietly walked away. To him, her calm felt almost disrespectful, as though she had ignored an order that everyone else would have accepted without question. He took a slow step closer until several nearby conversations stopped once again. "You still do not understand," he said with a confident smile. "People like us spent generations earning a place in rooms like this. You cannot simply arrive and expect to belong." Eleanor nodded in quiet agreement while Olivia folded her arms, wearing the satisfied expression of someone convinced the evening would end exactly as she imagined. Naomi met Richard's eyes without changing her posture. She neither defended herself nor challenged him. That silence seemed to frustrate him even more. "Say something," Olivia said. "Or is pretending to be important easier than proving it?" Naomi remained still. The music continued somewhere in the background, but for her, another memory quietly surfaced. She was 25 years old again, standing outside a charity fundraising banquet in Chicago after building her first successful company. She remembered arriving with a legitimate invitation, only to be questioned repeatedly while other guests walked inside without hesitation. She remembered smiling politely, answering every unnecessary question, and watching people judge her before learning her name. She had gone home that night, carrying something much heavier than disappointment. She carried a promise to herself that no amount of success would ever erase prejudice, but success could ensure she would never surrender her dignity to it. That memory disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Naomi returned her attention to the present. Richard interpreted her silence as defeat. "This is exactly what happens when people mistake confidence for status," he declared loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. One woman quietly lowered her glass. Another investor looked toward the stage instead of joining the conversation. The room no longer felt amused. It felt uncertain. Emily Carter watched everything unfold from across the ballroom, desperately searching for someone senior enough to intervene before the situation became irreversible. She caught the attention of the executive producer, who gave her a brief nod before disappearing behind the stage curtains with his phone pressed against his ear. Whatever conversation had just begun clearly carried urgency. None of the Whitmores noticed. Olivia stepped closer to Naomi and casually adjusted the edge of Naomi's evening shawl with an exaggerated smile before letting it slip from her shoulder to her arm. "There," she said softly. "At least now you look a little more presentable." The gesture drew several uneasy glances from nearby guests. Naomi calmly lifted the shawl back into place without changing her expression. She looked directly at Olivia and spoke for the first time in several minutes. Character always introduces itself before a business card ever does. Olivia laughed, believing she had won the exchange. Richard shook his head. "You still think words can change reality?" Naomi answered quietly. "No, decisions do." At that exact moment, her phone vibrated once inside her evening clutch. She did not reach for it immediately. She already knew what it meant. Across multiple corporate offices, attorneys had completed their review, board members had joined the secured conference line, and every document connected to the billion-dollar partnership now waited for a single executive instruction. While the Whitmore family continued celebrating a future they believed was guaranteed, the foundation beneath that future had already begun to disappear, one silent decision at a time. Naomi finally reached into her evening clutch and glanced at the secure message waiting on her screen. There were only 2 sentences. "Every executive board member is present, awaiting your final instruction." She locked the phone again without replying. There was no urgency in her movements because urgency belonged to people who had lost control. She had not. Across the country, senior attorneys, compliance officers, financial analysts, and board directors remained connected through an encrypted conference call. Confidential files rested unopened until Naomi made a single decision. No one spoke unnecessarily. Everyone understood that a partnership worth $1 billion could either move forward or disappear with one executive authorization. Back inside the ballroom, the master of ceremonies welcomed guests to take their seats for the evening's signature presentation. The giant display screens illuminated the room with elegant graphics celebrating innovation, leadership, and trust. The irony was impossible for Naomi to ignore. Around her, conversations grew more excited as investors predicted market growth and future headlines. Richard Whitmore accepted another round of congratulations with effortless confidence. He had already begun discussing expansion plans as though contracts had been signed hours earlier. Eleanor smiled warmly at influential donors while Olivia posed for photographs beside the foundation banner, convinced the evening would become another proud chapter in the Whitmore family legacy. Emily Carter stood near the backstage entrance, watching every detail unfold. She had finally reached the executive producer, who had quietly confirmed Naomi's identity through confidential event records and direct communication with corporate representatives. His face had turned pale during the call. Now he waited for additional instructions from organizers who suddenly realized they had allowed the most important executive of the night to stand alone while being publicly questioned. Before anyone could approach Naomi, another notification appeared on her phone. Legal review complete. Digital authorization suspended pending executive confirmation. Naomi read the message once before placing the phone away. She remained perfectly composed. The silence surrounding her no longer felt awkward. It felt deliberate. A veteran investment banker standing nearby noticed her calm expression and quietly whispered to a colleague, "She looks like someone who already knows how tonight ends." His colleague followed. Naomi with his eyes, but said nothing. Richard overheard the remark and laughed politely. "Confidence is free," he said. "Results are expensive." Naomi turned toward him with the same measured composure she had carried throughout the evening. "That is true," she replied. "Which is why wise people never celebrate before the final signature." Richard dismissed the comment with a casual smile, believing it was little more than an attempt to preserve dignity. He had no reason to suspect that every document connected to his family's future now rested inside a secure digital folder that could not move forward without the approval of the woman standing only a few feet away. Behind the stage curtains, event organizers hurried between production stations as quiet conversations replaced confident smiles. Schedules were reviewed again. Guest lists were verified for a second time. Security personnel received updated instructions to ensure Naomi Brooks would have unrestricted access to every restricted area. The atmosphere behind the scenes had completely changed, even though the audience remained unaware. The orchestra finished its final selection, and the ballroom lights gradually softened as the master of ceremonies prepared to introduce the evening's historic announcement. Hundreds of guests faced the stage with eager anticipation, believing they were seconds away from witnessing the beginning of an extraordinary business partnership. Only Naomi understood they were actually about to witness a decision that would redefine the entire night, and she remained absolutely certain that respect could never be negotiated after character had already revealed itself. The ballroom lights dimmed as the master of ceremonies walked confidently onto the stage, welcoming the audience to what he proudly described as the defining business partnership of the year. Applause echoed through the room while enormous display screens illuminated the elegant ballroom with images of innovation, economic growth, and corporate leadership. Richard Whitmore adjusted his jacket and smiled toward the cameras, completely convinced that the next few minutes would secure his family's place among the most influential names in American business. Eleanor gracefully joined him near the front of the stage while Olivia stood beside them, already anticipating the headlines that would follow by morning. Behind the curtains, however, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The executive producer quietly received one final confirmation through his headset before turning toward the master of ceremonies. His expression revealed a level of concern that had not existed earlier in the evening. He stepped onto the stage and whispered a short message into the host's ear. The host's confident smile disappeared for only a fraction of a second before returning with practiced professionalism. He cleared his throat and looked back toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "before we proceed with the signing ceremony, there has been a necessary adjustment to the program. We respectfully invite Ms. Naomi Brooks to join us on stage." The room instantly fell silent. Hundreds of guests turned toward the back of the ballroom, where Naomi calmly stood exactly where she had remained throughout the evening. Richard frowned in visible confusion. Eleanor exchanged a puzzled glance with Olivia. Around them, whispers spread from table to table as people tried to understand why an unfamiliar woman had suddenly become the center of the ceremony. Emily Carter quietly smiled, knowing the truth had finally reached the room. Naomi began walking toward the stage with measured confidence. Every step echoed across the polished marble floor as conversations faded into complete silence. She did not rush. She did not acknowledge the stunned expressions surrounding her. She simply carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who had never doubted where she belonged. When she reached the stage, the executive producer welcomed her with unmistakable respect before handing her a secure digital tablet. The master of ceremonies addressed the audience once again. Many of you know tonight's partnership by its public name. What many do not know is that every final authorization for this agreement rests with the executive founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Capital. He paused briefly before continuing. Please welcome Ms. Naomi Brooks. A wave of astonishment swept across the ballroom. Several guests immediately recognized the name. Others searched their memories as they recalled magazine covers, financial interviews, and leadership conferences they had seen over the years. Richard's confident smile disappeared entirely. Olivia stared at Naomi without saying a word. Eleanor slowly lowered her gaze, suddenly understanding every warning sign they had ignored throughout the evening. Naomi accepted the tablet before looking directly toward the Whitmore family. Her voice remained calm, steady, and unmistakably clear. Business is built on judgment, she said. Tonight, I was not evaluated by my experience, my integrity, or my work. I was evaluated by assumptions. If respect depends on recognizing someone's title, then it was never respect at all. The strongest partnerships begin with character long before contracts are signed. The ballroom remained completely silent. Every camera in the room pointed toward Naomi as the weight of her words settled over an audience that had just witnessed the difference between appearance and true authority. The silence inside the ballroom lingered for several long seconds after Naomi finished speaking. No one reached for a champagne glass. No one whispered another prediction about the evening's success. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier had dissolved into quiet disbelief. Richard Whitmore remained frozen near the stage, his expression shifting from confusion to realization as the full weight of what had happened settled over him. The woman he had dismissed without hesitation now stood at the center of the most important business decision of the year. The master of ceremonies stepped back respectfully while the executive producer handed Naomi the secured digital tablet containing the final authorization documents. Every display screen behind the stage now showed the Brooks Capital corporate emblem beside the partnership agreement. Financial journalists in the audience immediately reached for their phones. Camera operators adjusted their positions, recognizing that the story unfolding before them had become far more significant than the announcement they had originally expected to cover. Naomi reviewed the document without rushing. She read every page with the same discipline that had guided her throughout her career. Around the country, members of the Brooks Capital Executive Board remained connected through the secure conference line, waiting for her decision. The legal team had confirmed that every requirement had been satisfied. Only one choice remained. Richard finally stepped forward, his confidence replaced by careful restraint. Ms. Brooks, he began. Perhaps we should speak privately before the ceremony continues. Naomi looked at him calmly. Everything that happened tonight took place publicly. Her answer was respectful, yet impossible to misunderstand. Richard lowered his eyes for a brief moment before trying again. There has clearly been a misunderstanding. Naomi gently shook her head. No, Mr. Whitmore. There was an assumption. Those are not the same thing. The words settled across the ballroom with undeniable clarity. Eleanor quietly placed a hand on Richard's arm, but said nothing. Olivia stared toward the floor, no longer able to meet Naomi's eyes. Around them, several investors exchanged thoughtful glances as they reconsidered everything they had witnessed since the evening began. Naomi returned her attention to the digital agreement. She pressed one button to open the executive authorization screen. The room became completely still. Then, instead of signing, she selected another option. A confirmation message appeared. Partnership authorization withdrawn. Executive review concluded. The agreement immediately changed status across every connected system. Moments later, phones throughout the ballroom began vibrating almost simultaneously as investors, attorneys, and corporate advisors received the official notification. The proposed $1 billion partnership had been formally declined by Brooks Capital. A quiet wave of astonishment moved through the audience. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The decision had already become final. Naomi placed the tablet back into the executive producer's hands. Before addressing the audience one last time, successful companies invest in innovation, discipline, and trust. Those values cannot exist where people are measured by appearance instead of character. Brooks Capital will continue seeking partners whose actions reflect the principles they publicly celebrate. Several guests slowly began applauding. The applause started with only a few people, but steadily spread throughout the ballroom until it became the strongest response of the entire evening. It was not applause for a canceled business deal. It was applause for a standard that many people realized they had quietly abandoned. Naomi acknowledged the audience with a gracious nod, while the Whitmore family stood in complete silence, fully aware that the opportunity they believed was guaranteed had disappeared not because of a contract, but because of the choices they had made long before anyone knew who she truly was. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind remained with everyone in the ballroom. It was no longer the atmosphere of a celebration built on wealth or influence. It had become a quiet moment of reflection. Guests who had arrived expecting to witness the largest business announcement of the year found themselves discussing something far more valuable than a financial agreement. They had witnessed the cost of judging someone before learning who they truly were. Naomi Brooks thanked the event organizers for their professionalism after the situation had finally been understood. She shook hands with the executive producer and offered Emily Carter a warm smile. "Thank you for trusting what you saw instead of what everyone else assumed," Naomi said. Emily smiled with genuine relief. "I almost doubted myself." Naomi gently nodded. Integrity often begins with one person willing to ask one more question. Those words stayed with Emily long after the conversation ended. Around the ballroom, executives who had remained silent earlier quietly approached Naomi to introduce themselves properly. Several admitted they should have spoken sooner. Others thanked her for reminding them that leadership was measured long before contracts were signed. Naomi accepted every conversation with the same grace she had shown throughout the evening. She did not celebrate the canceled partnership because that had never been her goal. The decision had never been about revenge. It had been about responsibility. Every company reflects the character of the people trusted to represent it, and Brooks Capital would never separate business success from personal integrity. Richard Whitmore remained near the stage, watching the room transform around him. The admiration that had surrounded his family only an hour earlier had quietly shifted toward the woman he had underestimated. For the first time that evening, he understood that reputation could not protect someone from the consequences of poor judgment. Eleanor stood beside him in thoughtful silence while Olivia looked across the ballroom with an expression that no longer carried confidence, only reflection. The lesson would remain with them far longer than the disappointment of a lost opportunity. Outside, the cool Manhattan evening welcomed Naomi as she stepped onto the front entrance beneath the city lights. The sounds of traffic blended with the distant skyline, while photographers remained inside, covering the unexpected conclusion to the gala. Her driver opened the door, but before getting into the car, Naomi paused for a brief moment and looked back at the illuminated building. She smiled quietly. Not because she had won, but because she had remained faithful to the values that had carried her through every obstacle in her life. Success had given her influence, but dignity had always been her greatest strength. As her car disappeared into the New York streets, conversations inside the ballroom continued long into the night. Financial headlines the following morning would report that Brooks Capital had declined a historic $1 billion partnership. But the people who had been present knew the real story could never be captured by numbers alone. They had witnessed how quickly assumptions could destroy opportunity and how quietly true leadership revealed itself. Years later, many guests would remember neither the decorations, nor the speeches, nor the canceled agreement. They would remember a composed black woman who refused to answer disrespect with anger, who allowed patience to expose character, and who proved that the strongest authority never needed to announce itself. Because titles may open doors, wealth may command attention, and influence may shape industries. But genuine respect begins only when people choose to see another human being before they see appearance, status, or prejudice. That was the lesson everyone carried home, and it became the only legacy from that unforgettable evening that truly deserved to last.